Have you ever seen someone make the same mistake 28 times in a row? I came across this King James version only a meme. It appears to be an excerpt out of a book, actually, that was photographed. It's very similar to a lot of King James only memes that are out there. They have a table with a list of passages with the King James version rendering in comparison to other more modern translations of the English Bible. And the point of them is that the King James version is correct and that the others are incorrect. Typically, they're presented as intentional corruptions of God's word. And what I find is that with King James only adherents, they tend to go into this textual analysis on the assumption that the King James version is the standard. It is correct. And therefore, any deviation from that is a corruption. So they have the presupposition that the King James version is 100% pure, correct. That's the standard. Then any change from it, any change is going to be a change for the worse. What they don't do is evaluate the passages against the original language in the New Testament, say in the Koine Greek. They use the King James version as the standard. And so any deviation from that is going to be incorrect just by definition. So they're sort of assuming their conclusion or begging the question. And there's really two different branches of arguments along these lines. One of them has to do with word choice, which is what we're going to be talking about mostly today. The other one has to do with the source text, the text that's being translated. And one somewhat valid criticism that you'll see on these memes sometimes is they'll show where there's variation in the underlying text. And because most of the modern translations use the minority text from Alexandria, sometimes called the critical text, which is based on two manuscripts from about 400 AD. They're the oldest ones that we have extant. And these modern translations go on the assumption that oldest equals best or closest to the original. But those manuscripts actually have a lot of variation, not just with the majority text, but with each other. And the majority text is also used in some other modern translations, including the New King James. But King James only people will criticize the New King James. So some of these arguments about, the text they're based on, that's really only part of the story. They really think that the words being used, that any change in the words is a change for the worse. And I like the King James. I like it a lot. I'm not saying that the King James is a bad translation, but it is a 400-year-old translation and language changes over time. And so a lot of people struggle to read the King James Bible because of the difficulty in the language, the syntax of the language, and the vocabulary. There's a lot of words that are unfamiliar to readers today, and there's a lot of words that are used in a different sense than they're used today, and that can lead to a lot of misunderstandings. And that's what we're going to look at today. This meme appears to be photographed out of a book, making the case that the King James Bible is, the one true English Bible, or the one true Bible that all the world should be turning to. Imagine if you live in Greece and your native tongue is Greek, and you hear that there are King James only people in America that say if you want to read the real Bible, you have to read the King James Bible in English. And meanwhile, they're reading the New Testament in Greek as it was written, right? But their Bible is not valid, but they should learn English and read it out of the King James. It's pretty convoluted. But all that said, let's jump into it and see how this meme makes the opposite point that it was setting out to make. So we have a chart here. It's got 28 passages comparing where the King James Bible had the word master addressing Jesus in the Gospels, and in the modern translations, including the New King James, English Standard, and a couple of others, NIV, that these were rendered as, in most cases, teacher. And the heading at the top says, if the world wants a teacher and not a Lord and Master, the new versions are willing to accommodate, again following their habit of knocking each title of Jesus down one notch. So This is very common with King James only people, is that they assume negative intention for all the other Bible translators. Anyone who's setting out to make the Bible more readable, more accessible to modern readers that may find the King James to be difficult to read, they assume negative intentions. They assume that they're trying to corrupt the gospel, that they're trying to bring God down or bring Jesus down and things like that. So you can see here, there's the word master in the King James, the word teacher in these others, and it's assumed that that was a change that was made, or that was a decision that was made. They're kind of assuming that they're starting with, as if they're going to the King James Bible and saying, oh, I don't like this word, let's change it to this other word. But rather, it would be best if you see this difference and you wonder, well, why is this? You might want to consider what Greek word is being translated here, right? Yeah, so you've got a list of 28 passages here, most of which change master to teacher, and a couple of them where it says rabbi. You can see at the very top here, you have an example of where the King James only people will point to the manuscript discrepancies. They say where the King James Bible in Matthew 19:16, it says good master. In the others, it says teacher. Now, that's not actually true for the New King James, because the New King James uses the majority text, basically the same source text as the King James, but it is true the others just say teacher there. And the New King James, where there are these variants, will have a footnote to tell you what the variant is. So it'll have a footnote and you look at it and it says that the word good is omitted. Does that mean that this textual variance is like somebody's like, well, I don't like that it says that Jesus is good, so I'm going to take that out? Well, no, because there's lots of places that say that Jesus is good. And in fact, there's a parallel passage in Mark that's listed at the bottom here where they all say good master or good teacher. There's no discrepancy. So this is the kind of situation where the textual critics will argue about whether did they both say good originally and it got somehow omitted by mistake or whatever in the minority text, or early on were the two texts attempted to be reconciled and so good was inserted into Matthew. The bottom line is, with a lot of these textual variants, it really doesn't matter which way you go because the text is robust and it's a narrative. Because, like in this case, you have a parallel passage that has the word. You often have parallel passages where people are being quoted and they're not word for word the same, right? These are authors writing from their memory, and the quotes aren't exact word for word quotes, but they're based on somebody's telling of it. And so there's going to be variation between the gospels. And when you have a textual variance like this too, that's the question: is, was the majority text there from the very start and those minority texts are kind of like spin-offs, and maybe that's why they lasted so long, because they weren't of high quality, or somewhere along the line where these texts tried to reconcile and things like that. But the meaning, like the idea that good is missing from those two manuscripts, you can't really make the case that they're trying to denigrate God's goodness, because that message is still in there in lots of places. It doesn't get lost because of the omission of a single word in one passage. Okay, so when you're looking at this now and you say, okay, the King James uses the word master in 28 passages where the others usually use teacher, or in a few places we'll see rabbi. You might want to, I don't know, consider what does the word master mean, right? So in this heading, it's assumed that the intent when people are addressing Jesus as master is that it's being used as a synonym for Lord, right? If the world wants a teacher and not a Lord and master, so it said master, it must mean master in the sense of Lord. And so teacher is just, oh, we don't want to consider Jesus Lord, even though every one of these Bibles asserts that Jesus is Lord, right? All of them in, say, Romans 10:9 say, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, right? Like they all say that. So maybe there's something else going on here. Maybe there's a reason all these translations from the last century are using the word teacher instead of master. Well, how about we start by looking up the word master in the dictionary? So We're using definitions from the Merriam-Webster dictionary today. And you look up master, and definition 1A says a male teacher. So the word master means teacher. Does the word master always mean teacher? No, of course not. Definition 2 says one having authority over another, or one that conquers or masters. So in that sense, it's talking about rulers, governments, those who are superior over others. I would say today, when you hear the word master, without any context, that's usually the first thing that comes to mind. You think of master in some sort of role of authority or having charge over another. But it could also mean a male teacher. You think of schoolmaster, right? We still use that word a little bit. If someone says schoolmaster, you don't think about a government ruler, you think of a school teacher. So there's a good chance here, just based on looking up the word in the dictionary, that whoever put this meme together misunderstood because they're only using the King James Bible and they're not looking at any other, second opinion or even the Greek text. They'll look at the Greek text when it comes to textual variants and say, well, the vast majority of Bibles include this word, so the King James includes that word, and so it's better. But they don't want to do that when it comes to the language, right? Like, what is the Greek word being translated? Is it a word that means Lord, that sense of master, or is it a word that means teacher? And before we even look it up, the fact that every one of these modern translations from the last century or so are saying teacher, it's a good chance it's probably going to be the one that means teacher, right? So sure enough, when you pull up Matthew 19:16, for instance, the first one on this list, if we look up the Greek, you see that the word master is being translated from a Greek word, didaskalos. And that means teacher. It just means teacher. It doesn't mean Lord in any sense. So there's the definition. It's a masculine noun, means teacher, one who teaches, particularly one who teaches concerning the things of God, right? So this is certainly what Jesus is being addressed as in these passages. And it's derived from a verb, didasko, which means to teach. And it's where we get our English word didactic. You can see at the bottom here, it says to teach, to hold discourse with others in order to instruct them, to deliver didactic discourses, right? Didactic means intended to teach. Here's the definition for didactic, which is derived from this Greek word. It means designed or intended to teach. So another place we see today the word master used in sort of an educational teaching context is where you have a master's degree. And then beyond that is a doctorate, right? But when you hear the word doctor, if you hear the word doctor without any context, what image comes to your mind? Is it something like this? Probably not, right? It's probably something more like this, right? This guy, white lab coat, clipboard, a medical doctor, a physician, right? But doctor can also mean teacher. The definition, if you look it up again in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the first definition they give refers to a doctor of the church, someone declared a sound expounder of doctrine, like Thomas Aquinas is called a doctor of the church. Then 1B, a doctor is a learned or authoritative teacher. So you see a little bit of overlap here between the words like master and doctor, between teacher and someone with authority, because teachers have authority over their students, right? But this is really emphasizing when Jesus is being called master here, it's emphasizing his role as a teacher. The Greek says teacher explicitly. So a doctor, even though we tend to associate them, like it says in definition 2, a person skilled or specializing in healing arts, especially a physician, a dentist, or a veterinarian who holds an advanced degree and is licensed to practice. Like that's, Dr. Mario here. That's the image that comes to our mind when we hear doctor. And sometimes when people have the title of doctor and they're not a medical doctor, people will say, well, you're not a real doctor, because they think of a real doctor as being this. But really, anyone with an advanced degree, the doctorate degree, like that really means that you're qualified to teach. So in the King James Bible, in Luke 2:46, this is the scene where 12-year-old Jesus is missing during the Passover, and Mary and Joseph can't find him, and they find him in the temple after 3 days, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. That's how it's rendered in the King James Bible. You see the word doctors there. Now, hopefully, people reading the King James Bible aren't assuming that he's talking to medical doctors or physicians. But in the New King James, that is updated to say that he was sitting in the midst of the teachers. Would they object to this change too? Maybe, because any change from the King James is a problem. But this sure seems to be clearer. This is probably a little less confusing, reading the word teachers compared to doctors in this setting. And sure enough, if you look up what Greek word is being translated, it's didaskalos. It's the same word that was translated as master or teacher in all those verses from the original meme. So this could say sitting in the midst of the masters. Masters, doctors, they're synonymous with each other. They're synonymous with teacher. And today we use the word teacher when referring to those who teach. We almost never refer to them as doctors or masters, except in very limited contexts. So a doctor teaches doctrine. We have the word doctrine. You can see the connection there, that they're based on the same root. The definition here for doctrine says a principle or position of the body of principles in a branch of knowledge or a system of belief, right? So that's sort of like a religious doctrine, for instance. And down at the bottom there, 1E says something that is taught. That's the simplest definition. Now, over time, this word's taken on certain connotations, religious overtones and things like that. But at its base, you can see at the bottom there too, archaic, a teaching or an instruction. So a doctrine is something that you are taught, maybe by a doctor, because a doctor teaches, a doctrine is a teaching. Now, what do you call somebody who is on the receiving end of these teachings? The people who are calling Jesus master or teacher, what are they? Well, they're called disciples, right? One who accepts or assists in spreading the doctrines of another. This has come to specifically be synonymous with the 12 who would later become the apostles, the 12 apostles, or it's, someone who's convinced of a school or individual, a disciple of Freud is the example given here, like a student of Freud. It really means student. It's related to the word discipline, like a discipline. Back on the definition for schoolmaster, it says one that disciplines or directs. In that context, it's talking about teaching a discipline, a field of study. So that's what the word disciple means. It means student. All right, so in Matthew 10:24, in the King James Version, we read, "The disciple is not above his master, nor the servant above his Lord." Right? So you have two parallel statements here about one role in relation to the other. So the master in the King James here is being used as the person who has authority over a disciple. And that's a teacher-student relationship, right? Whereas in the second part, it says, nor the servant above his Lord. That's the Lord and master role, right? Someone who has authority over another, like a servant. So in the New King James, it's rendered, a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. So what words are being translated there? Well, of course, the word that's master in the King James and teacher in the New King James is didaskalos again, the word for teacher. And the word that's rendered as Lord in the King James and master in the New King James is kurios. That's the word for Lord. That's what we see in Romans 10:9, that if you confess that Jesus is Lord, right? The word Lord is kurios. So the New King James renders it as master because Lord and master, those are synonyms when used in relationship to a servant, right? But Lord has a little bit of a religious overtone, like you might associate that with deity. And so even though Lord is used as someone who has a servant, master is maybe a little more specific to understand, this servant master role. But those words are synonyms, right? And that's what the meme that we're going over refers to, Lord and master, wanting to say that master is a synonym for Lord. But it turns out that whoever wrote this book, made this meme, republished it, the people who are King James only are demonstrating that as those who don't want to use the King James all the time say, well, it's easy to misunderstand things. The King James only people here are demonstrating that point because this word master 28 times is used, and each time they've misinterpreted it to mean Lord when it actually means teacher. So if the word teacher is used there, you're not going to make that mistake. But because they use the word master, because they're myopic, they only look at the King James Bible and they won't consider, even when they see somebody else says, well, really that means teacher, they go, oh, you must be trying to undermine Christ's lordship. By the way, now one thing I want to point out here in Luke 2:46, notice that in the King James Version, the pronoun him, where it says, after 3 days they found him in the temple, it is not capitalized. But in the New King James, it is. So if I were to make the kind of argument that King James only people make, and are making that case in reverse for the New King James, I could say, oh, look, the King James people are undermining the deity of Christ. They don't even capitalize the pronouns in the words that refer to him. But that convention wasn't really a thing 400 years ago. That's something that's developed over time. There's no distinction in the original Greek. There was no capitalization of pronouns. There really, the first century Greek used all capitals for everything. It wasn't until many centuries later that there were distinctions between capital letters and what we call lowercase letters. So that would be a bad argument to make, right? It's just a different convention. And you can even see here in Matthew 17:24, for instance, where teacher and master are lowercase there, because that's an indirect reference to Jesus, where there's a question like, does your teacher, does your master? It actually is capitalized in the New King James in that context, but in most of the other translations listed there, it doesn't. So the New King James actually more consistently capitalizes words that refer to Jesus, both in the Old and New Testament. But that's just an editorial stylistic thing. Okay, so down at the bottom of this list, which the list doesn't seem to be in any particular order, but there are a few of them here at the bottom, 4 of them, that have the word rabbi in the modern translations. And the King James only person here says that that's bad. It's bad that they took the word master and replaced it with rabbi. So what word is being translated there that should be translated as master rather than rabbi? It's rabbi. That's the word. That's the Greek word. That's a Hebrew term for teacher. And so this is probably the word that was used in maybe all of these. The New Testament is written in Greek, but it is about people who generally did not speak Greek, certainly, to each other. They generally spoke Aramaic. So really the whole New Testament, almost all of the interactions we read were translated into Greek by the original authors. They're translating, what would have originally been in Aramaic. You only have little bits and pieces where you might have an Aramaic passage and then it'll say, which translated means such and such. And so in a few places here, we have the word rabbi retained. And this would be kind of like in movies that are set in a foreign country, but it's not subtitled. All the characters speak English because it's meant for an English speaking audience. But you might have, let's say you have a movie set in France about Napoleon or something like that. And occasionally a character might refer to someone as monsieur instead of sir, right? There'll be little bits and pieces of French in the language. It's understood that they were speaking French generally, but it's translated into English for the audience, right? And so this is probably what's going on here too. Probably all of these places where Jesus is being addressed as master, he was actually being referred to by the term that's transliterated as rabbi or rabbi. So when I was a kid, this was big stuff here. Masters of the Universe, 40 years ago or so, this was super popular. And at no point did any kid ever think, oh, this must be about astronomy teachers? This must be about teachers throughout the cosmos, right? Everyone thinks when they hear the word masters, even 40 years ago, every kid associated the word master with power and authority. And that's what this was all about. This was like a sword and sorcery mythos with these muscle bound people with magical powers and a little bit of technology mixed in there too. But it was about a struggle for power and it had nothing to do with teachers. And actually, while this was in development, It was originally going to be called the Lords of Power, but the name was changed because of the potential association or religious overtones with the word Lord. And so they used the synonym master. But nobody had any concern that, well, if we call it masters of the universe, people are going to think it's about teachers, right? That's just not a thing. So the word teacher, if you're translating a word that meant teacher in Greek, 400 years ago, it was perfectly appropriate to translate that as master because people would know 400 years ago when they read that, that meant teacher. But today when people read it, as the creator of this meme demonstrated, they misunderstand the word master to be associated with Lord, to have the definition of one with great authority. So the point that the author is making completely backfires. They're trying to say that the modern translators have ill intent by using the word teacher instead of master here, as if to say that Jesus is not Lord. But really what they're demonstrating is that they've misunderstood that word master. Every time they read it, they think it means Lord, but it actually means teacher. And so that makes a strong case that you should not solely rely on the King James Bible because you'll end up misunderstanding the text. So when I saw this meme online posted by one of my friends, I did go ahead and post a response. I'll show you what I wrote now, which would be sort of a summary of what we talked about today. The Greek word being translated, didaskalos, means teacher. It comes from the verb didasko, which means to teach. It's where we get our English word didactic, which means intended to teach. Master also means teacher, but people nowadays typically don't address teachers as master. And because there are other meanings for master, the word would likely be misinterpreted by the reader to mean something other than teacher. This entire post is evidence that that is the case, right? This whole post is built on the idea that it's so terrible that the translators are trying to take away the lordship of Christ by translating master as teacher, but they're not translating master as teacher, they're translating teacher as teacher. Word usage is different than it was 400 years ago. Even if an English word choice was perfectly spot on back then, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best word choice today. Correctly translating the Greek word for teacher as teacher does not diminish Christ's lordship. Each of those modern translations still affirm that Jesus is Lord, where that's what the Greek says, with the word kurios as found in Romans 10:9. So this meme utterly backfires. They read the word master, they misunderstand what is meant by that, and they end up attacking the people who correctly and appropriately have the word teacher in their translations so that the reader will understand that Jesus is being addressed as a teacher and not as Lord in these contexts. Disciples have teachers.